awareness, let alone regulation, of what's happening in our skies. And we know this because we have government documents that we have found and posted at geoengineeringwatch.org. One is 800 pages long. Your listeners can find this if they search our documents section. Important sections highlighted that specifically call for total blanket legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved with these programs. And here's another point, and I'll give it back to you, George. This document also calls for intergovernmental cooperation, even between governments with otherwise adversarial relationships, because you can't just geoengineer over your own country without affecting the entire world. So what's that mean? It means China, Russia, U.S., whatever the surface tensions may be, whatever the publicized conflicts may be, they are absolutely, positively colluding and cooperating on this issue, period.
Dane, with geoengineering, is there anything positive that comes out of this?
No. These operations are benevolent, period. And so your listeners understand the term. It means to engineer, to manipulate the planet's life support systems on a global scale. And that's what it is. And it's the primary term, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, again, stated official purpose to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy to slow down the warming of the planet. What else does that do? Destroys the ozone layer, completely disrupts the hydrological cycle, contaminates virtually everything. Now, this is nothing short of weather and biological warfare, George.
Who came up with this plan, Dane?
Many along the way. There are many contributors, and those that want to point a finger at people like Bill Gates, because they have openly discussed the need to do this immediately as if it's not happening already. But in fact, these operations were ongoing before Mr. Gates was even born.
Was it the military that concocted it first?
Certainly. We know these operations were first deployed at scale immediately after World War II. And George, you remember, I'm sure, that by the mid-70s, there was discussion of why wasn't the planet warming as fast as it was?
Right.
Are we entering an ice age? We had the whole of the so-called science community, climate science community, that weren't aware of the covert climate engineering operations that were first deployed at scale over the polar regions. It had an initial profound effect before the negative effects kick in, and we think statistical falsification was involved as well, but it looked like, it made it appear like the warming had leveled off, and that was simply a result of geoengineering and statistical falsification. As the negative effects began to manifest and the warming began to skyrocket again, by 1998 being the warmest year ever recorded to that point, what did the military-industrial complex do? They doubled down. They radically ramped up the programs in 98. They came up with the term climate change, George. Remember when that term suddenly came around instead of global warming? Climate change. And that's to cover the type of events you just described. These radical flash freeze going from literally, in the case of Denver, Colorado, 85-degree record highs to single digits in less than 24 hours. That's not nature. It's climate engineering.
I was there. I was getting on a plane when the temperatures were plummeting.
Yep.
And they had the crosswalk doors open because they needed to put bags in and out.
Yeah.
And it was blowing into the plane. And I've never felt anything that cold.
These materials are extremely cold to the touch. It's like a dry ice scenario to some degree. And in fact, chemically nucleated frozen material tends to sublimate like dry ice. What's that mean? Sublimation means that as these piles of chemically frozen material on the sides of roads and all over, much of that reverts from a solid to a gas and bypasses the liquid phase, so you don't get nearly as much runoff as you would from a naturally nucleated frozen material. Dry ice, of course, you get zero runoff. This material, you definitely get runoff, but not what you would have gotten if it were naturally nucleated.
Last year, which is not that far away, we had a massive fire in Maui in Hawaii. What do you think happened?
Here's what we can tell you definitively. And people, again, I encourage them not to believe anything I say, but to actually investigate. So we know climate engineering, which doesn't just involve the dispersion of these toxic nanoparticles in skies all over the world. It also involves the manipulation of these particles with radio frequency microwave transmissions like HAARP. I know you know what HAARP is, George, and many of your listeners, because they're astute buddies also.
Thanks to our buddy Nick Baggage.
Yes, Nick Baggage. He is certainly the renowned expert on HAARP, which is an ionosphere heater. Your listeners can look that up, ionosphere heater. It's a weapon of mass destruction. It's not benign. It can heat the ionosphere to profoundly high temperatures, expanding the atmosphere up and down And that downward push manipulates pressure zones. I'm leaning back to Lahaina. Manipulates pressure zones in the atmosphere that can then steer upper level wind currents. So in Lahaina, we had a very anomalous high pressure zone to the north, which spins clockwise in the northern hemisphere. We had a very anomalous low pressure zone to the south that was almost a record trajectory for a low pressure distance traveled. That spins counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. And between the two, even though they're both considerable distance from Lahaina, you still create a pressure tunnel in the middle that created a wind zone right over Lahaina. So, in essence, you created a blowtorch. Whatever the source of ignition, and that's a completely separate subject, whatever the source of ignition, once there is ignition, and you have a region like Lahaina with 80-mile-an-hour horizontal winds, you have incendiary materials that have been dropped for extended time frames beforehand. We know these particles, like aluminum nanoparticulates, those are incendiaries. In fact, so much so that they're used in thermite, which is a demolition. So you have foliage and structures coated with this incendiary material. You have a horizontal 80-mile-an-hour wind. You had flash drought, which was declared in Lahaina the week before. Climate engineering is used to dry out regions beforehand. It's used to create drought. We have the leaders of countries like Iran on the floor of the UN stating NATO's cutting off our precipitation. You wonder why some of those people over there don't like us? Because we're manipulating the weather, cutting off their rain and destroying their crops. So we had the same thing in Lahaina. So dried it out, incendiary dust, create a wind tunnel, horizontal wind, blowtorch, whatever the source of ignition, town's gone.
Frightening work, Dane. It truly is.
How about Acapulco? Similar circumstance.
And what about Canada?
What about Canada? The same thing with the fires there. I encourage your listeners to search the Engineering Wildfire section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org, and within that they can find U.S. military document titled, we found that and posted it, Forest Fires as a Military Weapon. 140 pages long, describing exactly the kind of preparation that I just described to incinerate regions and create massive firestorms. So in the case of Canada, 72,000 acres burned. That's, to put that in perspective, that's bigger than the states of Florida or Georgia in 1 year. 71,000 acres. Why would the climate engineers want to lay the template for that? Again, the source of ignition, separate subject. We have peer-reviewed study that advocates for the burning, intentional burning of northern latitude forests to put enough particulate matter in the air to provide temporary cooling. Is that not total insanity? And George, you remember when the big smoke cloud came down over the northeast and it cooled the region down by about 30 degrees? Remember that?
Dramatically, yeah.
So, again, people don't realize there's a lot of moisture in smoke. When you're incinerating the moisture out of all that foliage, that can actually precipitate. If you get a pyrocumulus cloud, you can actually have a fire cloud that creates rain. But as that moisture drifts down over some of the northeast areas, it appears from all the able data that they're actually then chemically nucleating that moisture to cool it down even further. I mean, this is last-ditch efforts of the clinically insane